In the suffocating labyrinth of Norman hedgerows, where every sunken lane promised ambush and every Bocage wall concealed death, Lance Corporal Thomas Brennan discovered something the entire Allied command had missed. The Germans weren't watching the ground, they were watching the sky. What happened in those 63 seconds on 17th June 1944 shouldn't have worked. A fragment of mirror glass, a principle of physics any schoolboy knew, and 22 of Hitler's elite Panzer Grenadiers eliminated without a single British casualty. The German after-action report, declassified in 1987, contained a single word underlined 3 times: unmöglich. The metallic taste of Norman rain mixed with cordite hung in Lance Corporal Thomas Brennan's throat as he pressed himself against the ancient stone wall, its moss-covered surface cold even through his battle dress. 0547 hours, 11th of June, 1944, 5 days since the beaches. The Bocage of Normandy had become Britain's newest graveyard, and no amount of training at Aldershot had prepared the lads for this medieval nightmare of 12-foot hedgerows, sunken lanes, and killing corridors where German machine gunners had fields of fire measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. Brennan was 24, a Manchester toolmaker's son who'd learned patience threading dies in his father's shop before the call-up. That patience had kept him alive through North Africa and Sicily, whilst better shots had caught bullets trying to be heroes. The 1st Battalion, Somerset Light Infantry, had lost 47 men in 4 days, not to grand tank battles or artillery barrages, but to bloody-minded German infantry who'd transformed each hedgerow into a fortress and each sunken lane into an abattoir. The mathematical brutality was inescapable. Every 100 yards gained cost the battalion an average of 3.2 casualties. At that rate, they'd be combat ineffective within a fortnight. The Germans held every advantage. Intimate knowledge of terrain they'd fortified for weeks, interlocking fields of fire, and the maddening reality that British doctrine, designed for open warfare, had collided catastrophically with this prehistoric landscape where visibility ended at 20 feet. Sergeant William Davies crouched beside Brennan in the pre-dawn gloom, his weathered face showing the strain of 4 years' continuous service. "Third patrol in 12 hours hasn't returned," Davies muttered, his Welsh accent thick with exhaustion. "Panzer Grenadiers from the 12th SS. They're not like the regular Wehrmacht lads. These bastards want to die for Hitler and they're keen to take us with them." The tactical situation had become untenable. The Somerset Light Infantry was tasked with clearing the village of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, but the Germans had established defensive positions in the Bocage approaches that turned every advance into a suicide mission. British infantry doctrine called for fire and movement, suppression and assault, but the hedgerows negated that entirely. You couldn't suppress what you couldn't see. You couldn't flank when every field was a separate fortress. Company Commander Major Hartley had sent 3 separate requests up the chain for armour support, artillery preparation, even RAF ground attack sorties. Each request had been denied. The armour was bogged down on the narrow lanes, the artillery was rationed because ammunition was still scarce ashore, and the RAF couldn't see targets through the canopy. The Somerset Light Infantry would clear the Bocage with rifle and bayonet, or they'd die trying. Current casualty projections suggested the latter was more likely. Brennan had watched good men die to this equation. Private Collins, a Devonshire farm boy who'd survived D-Day, caught a burst from a hidden MG-42 whilst crossing what looked like empty ground. Corporal Henderson, a Glaswegian who'd fought at El Alamein, killed by a sniper he never saw whilst trying to establish an observation post. The Germans were invisible, dug into positions that British tactics couldn't dislodge, without casualties that would destroy the battalion's combat effectiveness. The breaking point came at 13:20 hours on 14th of June, when Lieutenant Pemberton led 2nd Platoon in a textbook assault on a suspected German position. Pemberton was Sandhurst-trained, a thorough officer who followed doctrine precisely, covering fire, smoke grenades, fire and movement by section. It should have worked. The German Panzer Grenadiers waited until second platoon was committed, then opened fire from 3 positions simultaneously, positions British scouts had checked and declared clear 2 hours earlier. Pemberton died instantly, shot through the head. His platoon sergeant, a veteran named Morris, took command and tried to withdraw under fire. 9 men went forward, 4 came back. The remaining 5 were left in that blood-soaked field because retrieving bodies under German machine gun fire would cost more lives. Major Hartley sat in the battalion command post that evening, staring at the casualty reports with the expression of a man watching mathematics prove that his command was being slowly murdered. Brennan had watched it happen from an overwatch position 200 yards distant, close enough to see everything, too far to help. The helplessness burned worse than the fear. He was a sniper, trained to kill at distance, but the Bocage negated even that advantage. British sniper doctrine assumed visibility, elevation, standoff distance. The Norman hedgerows provided none of those. German snipers were winning this battle because they'd adapted to the terrain, whilst British shooters were still following rules written for different ground. That evening, sheltering in a barn that smelled of old hay and newer death, Brennan cleaned his Lee Enfield No. 4, T, and tried to solve an impossible equation. The Germans could see British advances before British scouts could identify German positions. That shouldn't be possible. Both sides were working with the same terrain, the same hedgerows, the same sight lines. Yet somehow, the Germans consistently achieved first-shot advantage, and in sniper work, first shot was usually the only shot that mattered. Private Jenkins, Brennan's spotter, sat against the barn wall meticulously cleaning binoculars that wouldn't help them spot invisible Germans. Jenkins was 19, a Liverpool dockworker's son with steady hands and excellent vision. "It's like they're bloody ghosts, Tommy," Jenkins muttered. "How are they seeing us when we can't see them?" The question wouldn't leave Brennan's mind. German equipment wasn't superior. Their rifles were arguably inferior to the Lee Enfield. Their optics no better than British glass. They weren't supermen. They bled and died when you could bring fire to bear, yet they possessed situational awareness that British forces couldn't match, and men were dying because of it. Sergeant Davies entered the barn carrying a mess tin of tea, real tea, somehow procured despite the supply situation. "Drink up, lads." Majors called an orders group for 600. "We're going back into that meat grinder tomorrow, and he wants ideas that don't involve getting the entire company killed." Brennan accepted the tea gratefully, the warmth spreading through hands that hadn't been properly warmed since the landing. "Sarge, the Germans aren't magic. There's something we're missing, some technique or tactic that's giving them the advantage." Davies nodded slowly. "You're a clever lad, Tommy. Your dad said you were always figuring out how things worked, finding better ways to do jobs in the shop. Well, figure this out, because at current casualty rates, the Somerset Light Infantry ceases to exist as a combat formation in 11 days. That's not strategy, that's arithmetic. The tea tasted of iron from the water, but it was British tea, and there was something about that which steadied a man's nerves. Brennan lay back against his pack, watching shadows from a guttering candle play across the barn's ancient rafters. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the walls, German Panzer Grenadiers were settling into their positions, confident in their superiority, certain that tomorrow would bring more British dead. But Brennan was already thinking about angles, about sight lines, about the one thing every soldier forgot in the heat of combat, that observing the enemy meant being observable in return. The Germans were seeing British movements before British forces could identify German positions. That implied the Germans possessed elevation or observation points that British scouts weren't detecting. But the terrain was flat, no hills, no dominant features, just endless hedgerows creating cellular compartments of death. Unless elevation wasn't the answer, unless the Germans weren't looking down at British forces, unless they were looking somewhere else entirely and British doctrine had simply never considered the possibility. Brennan sat up suddenly, his mind racing through the geometry of observation and concealment. Jenkins looked over, concerned. "You all right, Tommy?" Get some sleep, lad. I need to work something through. As Jenkins settled into an uneasy sleep, Brennan pulled out a small notebook, the sort of thing his father had kept in the shop for sketching out machining problems, and began drawing diagrams in the candlelight. Angles of observation, reflection angles. The basic optics any grammar school student knew, but which British military doctrine had apparently forgotten. If he was right, and the mathematics suggested he might be, then the Germans weren't superior soldiers. They were simply looking in a direction British forces had forgotten existed. And if Brennan could prove it, if he could demonstrate the technique, then perhaps the Somerset Light Infantry wouldn't have to watch 11 more days count down to extinction. The candle guttered and died, plunging the barn into darkness. Outside, the Norman rain continued its steady drumbeat on ancient stone. And somewhere in that wet darkness, German soldiers were preparing for another day of killing British infantrymen who couldn't see them coming. But Thomas Brennan, Manchester toolmaker's son, sat in the darkness with a half-formed theory that might, just might, even the odds in Britain's favour. Dawn broke grey and grudging over the Norman Bocage on 15th of June 1944, revealing a landscape that seemed designed by some malevolent deity, specifically to frustrate military operations. Brennan had slept perhaps 2 hours, his mind churning through the problem with the methodical precision his father had drilled into him at the lathe. Measure twice. Cut once, Tommy. Mistakes in metal can't be undone. The orders group at 600 hours was a grim affair. Major Hartley spread a map across a salvaged door, laid atop ammunition crates in what remained of a farmhouse kitchen. The map was already marked with red crosses, each representing a British casualty location. The pattern was damning. Kills clustered along approach routes, where British forces should have had concealment, where doctrine said they were advancing properly. "Gentlemen," Hartley began, his cultured voice betraying the exhaustion of 5 days' continuous combat. "Brigade is insistent. We take the crossroads at Saint-Laurent by 1800 hours tomorrow, or they'll send the Canadians to do it instead." The implied shame of that scenario hung in the air. The Somerset Light Infantry had a lineage stretching back to 1685. Letting colonials accomplish what they could not was unthinkable. Captain Morrison, commanding A Company, pointed at the map with a cigarette-stained finger. "Sir, the approaches are death traps. Every time we try to establish a base of fire, German snipers and machine gunners engage from positions we've already cleared. It's as if they're watching our scouts in real time." Brennan cleared his throat. A lance corporal speaking at an orders group was irregular, but Davies had ensured he was present. "Permission to speak, sir?" Hartley looked up, his eyes bloodshot but sharp. "You're Brennan, aren't you? Davies says you've been thinking about our German friend's apparent omniscience. Let's hear it." Brennan moved to the map, his finger tracing the approaches to the German positions. "Sir, we've been assuming the Germans have better observation posts, better concealment or superior fieldcraft. But what if they're not looking where we think they're looking?" Morrison frowned. "Explain, Lance Corporal." "Sir, every soldier knows to watch their front, the ground ahead, the hedgerow opposite, the sunken lane that might conceal the enemy. But what if the Germans aren't primarily watching the ground? What if they're watching above it?" The room fell silent. Lieutenant Foster, a young officer fresh from Britain who'd survived exactly 3 days in Normandy, spoke hesitantly. "Above it? You mean they're watching the sky?" "Not the sky itself, sir. The light. Specifically, how sunlight reflects off equipment, helmets, even faces when men look upward to clear overhead cover. The bocage creates a canopy, which means directional lighting, mostly from above. When a British soldier moves through a sunken lane or along a hedgerow base, he's in shadow. But his helmet, his rifle sling buckle, his field dressing pouch, anything with even slight reflectivity, catches overhead light and creates a signal visible to observers who know to look for it." Hartley leaned forward, his interest sharpening. "You're suggesting the Germans are detecting us through reflection rather than direct observation?" "More than that, sir. I think they're using reflection themselves. Mirror glass, polished metal, anything that allows indirect observation." A sniper doesn't need to expose himself to watch an approach if he can position a reflective surface to show him what's happening without breaking cover. Basic physics, sir. Angle of incidence equals angle of reflection. Davies, who'd been listening intently, added his support. The lad's got a point, sir. We've been so focused on concealment from direct observation that we've forgotten about indirect observation methods. The Germans learned this on the Eastern Front. The Russians used similar techniques in Stalingrad. Morrison remained skeptical. That's a fine theory, Lance Corporal, but theories don't hold ground. Can you prove it? Brennan reached into his battle dress pocket and withdrew something wrapped in a handkerchief, a shard of mirror glass, roughly 4 inches square, salvaged from a shattered farmhouse. I'd like to try, sir. Give me Jenkins and permission to conduct a reconnaissance patrol. If I'm right, I can identify German observation posts and potentially neutralize them using their own techniques against them. Major Hartley studied the young sniper for a long moment. The mathematics of desperation were simple. Continuing current tactics guaranteed the battalion's destruction. Attempting something unorthodox might accelerate that destruction, but it might also provide the breakthrough they desperately needed. Very well. You have until 1400 hours. Davies, you'll accompany them as patrol commander. If this reflection theory proves correct, we'll brief it to the entire battalion. If not, he didn't finish the sentence. They all knew what failure meant. By 0750 hours, Brennan, Jenkins and Sergeant Davies were moving through the Bocage with painful slowness, utilizing every scrap of cover the terrain provided. The morning rain had stopped, which meant better visibility, but also less sound masking. Each footfall was calculated, each movement considered. German patrols were active, and contact at this stage would waste the entire exercise. Brennan had explained his theory more fully during the approach. The Germans can't maintain continuous direct observation on all approaches. They lack the manpower, and exposure equals vulnerability. But if they've positioned reflective observation devices at key points, a single observer can monitor multiple approaches simultaneously. A mirror, angled properly, can show what's happening 50 yards away without the observer exposing himself. It's brilliant, really. Simple physics instead of complex technology. Jenkins, carrying the patrol's binoculars and serving as spotter, whispered, "So how do we counter it?" "We look where they're looking. We identify the reflection sources. And then," Brennan hefted his mirror fragment, "we use the same technique to observe them without being observed. Once we know where they are, a conventional shot solves the problem." The hedgerow they were navigating ran along what had been a property boundary for perhaps 1,000 years, ancient stones intermixed with earth and roots, topped by hawthorn and bramble that created a natural barrier 12 feet high and equally thick. German positions were known to be approximately 200 yards ahead, commanding a sunken lane that was the only viable approach to the Saint-Laurent crossroads. At 8:43 hours, Brennan called a halt. They were in a position offering good concealment, a small depression where the ancient hedgerow had partially collapsed, creating a natural hide. "Here," he breathed. "We set up observation here." The technique required patience that most soldiers lacked. Brennan didn't raise his head to look over the hedgerow. That was suicide. Instead, he carefully extended the mirror fragment through the brambles at ground level, angling it upward. The physics were elegant. Light from the area ahead would strike the mirror surface, and the reflection would angle downward to where Brennan lay prone behind cover. For 17 minutes, nothing. Jenkins was beginning to show skepticism, shifting uncomfortably. Davies remained motionless. A veteran knew patience won more battles than heroism. Then Brennan whispered, "Contact, 11 o'clock, approximately 180 yards." In the mirror's reflection, impossibly small but unmistakable, Brennan could see what direct observation would never have revealed. A brief flash of reflected light from within the opposite hedgerow. Not continuous, just a momentary gleam. They've got a mirror positioned in that hedgerow facing this approach, which means there's an observer watching that mirror's reflection. Davies studied the area through binoculars, seeing nothing with direct observation. I'll be damned. Can you locate the actual observer position? Working on it, Sarge. Brennan adjusted his mirror angle incrementally, searching. The geometry was complex. He needed to find the reflection of their observation mirror, which meant calculating sightlines and angles whilst lying prone in mud. This was why his father's trade had been valuable training. Precision work under difficult conditions was the same, whether you were machining steel or hunting men. At 0907 hours, he found it. 2 o'clock from the first reflection, approximately 15 yards. There's a second reflection source. That's the observer's position. He's using a mirror to watch the approach mirror, which means he's completely concealed from direct observation, but has full situational awareness of this entire approach. The tactical implications were profound. A single German sniper with 2 pieces of mirror glass could monitor approaches that would traditionally require multiple observers in exposed positions. It was brilliant, economical, and explained entirely why German forces consistently achieved first-shot advantage despite having no obvious observational superiority. Davies was already calculating fire solutions. Can you engage him? Not from here. Wrong angle, and I'd have to expose myself to get a direct sightline. But I can set up a reflection shot. Jenkins looked confused. A reflection shot? You're going to shoot at a mirror? No, lad. I'm going to use my mirror to observe his position without exposing myself, calculate the range and angle, and then take a shot based on the reflection geometry. If my calculations are right, I can put a round through that hedgerow into his position without ever having direct visual confirmation of the target. It was insane. It was mathematically sound. And it was the only tactical option that didn't involve exposing British soldiers to German fire. Brennan spent 23 minutes calculating. The range was approximately 190 yards, well within the Lee-Enfield's effective range. The angle required shooting through the hedgerow itself, which meant the round would be deflected by branches, but at close range, the .303 round would retain sufficient energy to be lethal. At 0934 hours, Brennan carefully positioned himself, the rifle's barrel extending minimally through the hedgerow base. He couldn't use the telescopic sight. There was nothing to see with direct observation. Instead, he was aiming at a point in space calculated from reflection geometry, adjusted for bullet drop, wind drift, and the probable deflection from shooting through vegetation. "This is mad," Jenkins whispered. "This is mathematics," Brennan corrected. "Sarge, on your mark." Davies checked his watch, calculated the risk, and nodded. "Send it." The Lee-Enfield's report was shockingly loud in the morning stillness, a clean crack that echoed off the ancient stones. For 3 seconds, nothing. Then, distantly, a cry of pain. Sharp, German, unmistakable. Brennan immediately adjusted his observation mirror. The German sniper's position mirror had shifted angle, moved by its operator's death or injury. In his own mirror, Brennan could now see into the German position. A Wehrmacht soldier, perhaps 25, wearing the smock of a Panzer Grenadier, was clutching his shoulder, blood visible even in the tiny reflection. The .303 round had transited the hedgerow, deflected slightly, and struck the German sniper in his upper body, not a killing shot, but certainly a disabling one. "Target hit," Brennan confirmed. "He's combat ineffective." Davies was already moving them back, aware that German forces would respond to the shot. But as they withdrew through the Bocage, the sergeant was smiling, a rare expression. "Right, Tommy, you've proved your theory. Now we need to teach it to the entire battalion before 1800 tomorrow." By 14:30 hours, they were back at battalion headquarters. Major Hartley listened to the report with increasing interest, asking precise questions about angles, distances, and methodology. When Brennan finished, the major was quiet for nearly a minute. A dangerous silence. Finally, "Gentlemen, this changes everything. If the Germans are using mirror observation, we can counter it. More importantly, we can adopt it ourselves. Morrison, I want every officer and NCO briefed on this technique by 1800 hours today. Every section needs at least one man who understands basic reflection geometry. And I want mirror glass salvaged from every destroyed building in our area. This becomes standard kit. Captain Morrison was already making notes. Sir, shouldn't we report this up to brigade? This could affect operations across the entire sector. We will, after we've proven it works on a larger scale. Tomorrow's attack on Saint-Laurent will serve as proof of concept. If Brennan's technique works at battalion scale, we'll have something to show brigade besides casualty reports. That evening, Brennan found himself briefing groups of hardened soldiers on principles of physics they'd last encountered in grammar school, if at all. Some were skeptical. Veterans who'd survived years of combat didn't take kindly to being lectured by a lance corporal. But Davies and the other sergeants enforced attendance, and gradually, understanding dawned. Corporal Henderson, who'd survived the morning's patrol that killed Lieutenant Pemberton, grasped it immediately. So instead of raising our heads to look over a hedgerow, which makes us targets, we use a mirror to look indirectly. And if the Germans are doing the same, we look for their mirrors and either avoid those sight lines or engage the mirror's operators. Exactly, Brennan confirmed. And it works for more than observation. You can use a mirror fragment on an extended pole to check around corners, over walls, anywhere you'd traditionally expose yourself. It won't replace direct observation for fire control, but it provides situational awareness without vulnerability. By 2100 hours, the battalion had salvaged 47 usable mirror fragments from destroyed buildings. Some were tiny, barely 2 inches square. Others were substantial sections of shattered-looking glasses. Each was issued to a designated section member with instructions on employment. Major Hartley addressed the assembled company commanders and senior NCOs in the barn that served as battalion headquarters. Tomorrow, we discover whether ingenuity can counter superior fieldcraft. We've lost too many good men to German observation superiority. If Lance Corporal Brennan's technique proves effective, we'll have evened the odds. If not, again, that unfinished sentence. They all understood. Failure meant more crosses on the map. Brennan lay in his bedroll that night, listening to rain resume its percussion on the barn roof. Jenkins was snoring softly, the exhausted sleep of youth. Somewhere in the darkness, German soldiers were settling into their positions, confident in another day of killing British infantry with impunity. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, British forces would be looking where the Germans didn't expect, seeing what they'd hidden, and bringing to bear the one advantage Britain had never lost, even in her darkest hours: the ability to adapt, improvise, and turn adversity into innovation. Thomas Brennan, Manchester toolmaker's son, closed his eyes and dreamed of angles. The dawn of 16th of June 1944 broke with the grudging grey light characteristic of Norman June, neither dark nor properly illuminated, just a gradual lessening of night that turned the Bocage from black to charcoal. Brennan had been awake since 0400, conducting final briefings with the sections that would lead the assault on Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer. Each man now carried mirror fragments in various sizes, understanding at least theoretically how to employ them. The battalion's plan was straightforward in concept, murderously difficult in execution. A company would advance along the sunken lane approach, the same killing ground that had consumed Lieutenant Pemberton's platoon 48 hours earlier. B Company would provide fire support from positions already held. C Company remained in reserve, ready to exploit any breakthrough or reinforce failure. The difference today was methodology. Every advance would be preceded by mirror reconnaissance, and German observation posts would be identified through reflection detection before British forces exposed themselves. Major Hartley had positioned himself with a company headquarters, a calculated risk that demonstrated his confidence in the new technique. At 06:15 hours, he gave Brennan a measured look. "Lance Corporal, You've staked your credibility and potentially the lives of 200 men on geometry. I trust the mathematics are sound? Sir, the physics are solid. The application in combat conditions, we're about to discover that together. Fair answer. Take position with the lead section. You'll identify German observation points and will either avoid or neutralize them before advancing. God save the King. God save the King, sir. By 0640 hours, Brennan and Jenkins were positioned at the entrance to the sunken lane, the exact location where British forces had been ambushed repeatedly. The lane itself was perhaps 12 feet wide, flanked by hedgerows that rose vertically another 12 feet. Visibility extended perhaps 30 yards before the lane curved. Traditional doctrine said to send scouts forward to clear the lane. Those scouts were invariably killed or pinned by German fire from concealed positions. Brennan's approach was different. Lying prone at the lane entrance, completely concealed by the hedgerow base, he extended his largest mirror fragment, a piece of looking glass roughly 8 inches square, through the vegetation at ground level. Angling it carefully, he began scanning the lane ahead through the reflection. For 4 minutes, nothing appeared unusual. Then, at approximately 70 yards distance, a brief flash, light reflecting off something metallic or glass-like in the left hedgerow. "Contact," Brennan whispered into the radio handset Davies had provided. "Left side, 70 yards. German observation mirror confirmed." Davies, positioned with the lead section 20 yards behind, acknowledged. "Can you locate the observer?" "Working it." Brennan adjusted his mirror angle, searching for the secondary reflection that would reveal the observer's actual position. The geometry was complex. He was looking at the reflection of a reflection, calculating angles in 3 dimensions whilst prone in cold mud. But at 0648 hours, he found it. A second reflection source, approximately 10 yards behind and right of the observation mirror. Observer position identified. Right side, 80 yards, concealed in hedgerow base. "Can you engage?" Davies asked. "Negative, wrong angle from here. But I can guide a section forward to engagement range if they stay below the observation mirror's sight line." What followed was a masterclass in adapted tactics. Using Brennan's mirror observations, Davies guided second section forward through the sunken lane, keeping them positioned where the German observation mirror couldn't detect their movement. It took 17 minutes to advance 30 yards, glacially slow by conventional standards, but accomplished without a single shot fired or a single casualty taken. At 0711 hours, second section was in position, near enough to engage the German observer's position, but still undetected. Corporal Henderson, commanding the section, whispered into his radio, "Brennan, give me a precise location. 3 o'clock from your position, approximately 50 yards, concealed in the hedgerow base. You're looking for the base of a large hawthorn. The observer is positioned directly behind it. He's using a mirror to watch his forward observation mirror, which means he's not watching for direct approach from the flanks." Henderson designated 2 riflemen, positioning them carefully. "On my mark, 3, 2, 1, fire." 2 Lee Enfield rifles cracked simultaneously. In his observation mirror, Brennan saw the German position convulse. Direct hits. The German sniper's observation mirror fell forward, its angle shifting uselessly. "Target neutralized," Brennan confirmed. "Observation mirror is down. Observer is combat ineffective." For the first time since landing in Normandy, British forces had eliminated a German position without suffering casualties. The psychological impact on second section was immediate. These were men who'd watched mates die to invisible Germans for 5 days. Suddenly, the invisible had become visible, and British marksmanship could be brought to bear. But the German defenders weren't finished. At 0723 hours, as A Company began advancing through the cleared section of lane, German machine gun fire erupted from a position further down the approach, an MG-42 firing in short, disciplined bursts. The rounds impacted the hedgerows, sending splinters and earth flying. A company immediately went to ground, seeking what cover the lane provided. This was the critical moment. Traditional doctrine called for suppressive fire and assault, but that assumed you knew where the machine gun nest was actually located. The Germans had positioned it for maximum effect, covering the approach without exposing the gun's location. Major Hartley's voice came across the radio net, calm despite the circumstances. "Brennan, I need that MG position identified now." Brennan had already shifted position, moving laterally along the hedgerow to gain a different angle. The MG-42's distinctive sound, like tearing canvas, continued in disciplined bursts. Whoever commanded that gun knew his business. He was firing blind harassment fire, denying the British advance without wasting ammunition. But firing meant muzzle flash, and muzzle flash meant light emission. Extending his mirror through a different section of hedgerow, Brennan searched for the reflection of muzzle flash in the German observation systems. For 12 seconds, an eternity under fire, he saw nothing. Then the MG-42 fired another burst, and in his mirror, Brennan caught the reflection of reflected muzzle flash. The Germans were using multiple mirror positions to coordinate fires. The machine gunner wasn't observing directly, but was receiving targeting information through reflected signals. "Got them," Brennan transmitted. "Machine gun is right side, approximately 120 yards, elevated position in hedgerow. They're using a mirror system for fire control. The gunner can't see you directly, but is receiving corrections from an observer with mirror observation." Captain Morrison, commanding a company, immediately grasped the tactical situation. "If we suppress the observer, the gunner goes blind?" "Correct, sir. The observer is approximately 20 yards behind and left of the gun position. Take out the observer, and the gunner loses situational awareness." Morrison designated a fire team with specific orders. "Engage the observer position with concentrated rifle fire. Ignore the machine gun nest itself. It violated conventional doctrine. You were supposed to suppress the crew-served weapon first, but conventional doctrine had been bleeding them dry for 5 days. At 07:29 hours, 8 Lee Enfield rifles fired as one, concentrating fire on the observer position Brennan had identified. In the sudden silence after that volley, the MG-42 fired one more burst, but the angle was wrong, the rounds impacting 10 yards right of a company's actual position. The gunner was firing blind, without observation. Henderson's section immediately advanced under covering fire, flanking the machine gun position, and at 07:32 hours, the German gun went silent permanently, grenades and close assault finishing what mirror reconnaissance had begun. A company resumed its advance. By 8:45 hours, they'd progressed 200 yards through terrain that had cost 47 casualties over the previous 5 days. Current casualties: 0 killed, 2 lightly wounded by splinters. The mathematical transformation was staggering, from unsustainable losses to acceptable risk, all because British forces were now seeing what the Germans had hidden. But it was the German reaction that Brennan found most revealing. At 09:03 hours, whilst observing the next section of approach through his mirror, he witnessed something extraordinary. A German soldier, partially visible in reflection, examining his own observation mirror with obvious confusion. The soldier adjusted the mirror, checked the angle again, then looked around nervously. The Germans had realized something had fundamentally changed, but they didn't understand what. Their observation systems were being countered, their ambush positions identified and neutralized before they could engage. The invisible advantage they'd held for 5 days had evaporated, and German defenders were experiencing what British forces had endured since D-Day, the psychological horror of being watched by an enemy you couldn't locate. At 10:47 hours, a company reached the outskirts of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, 4 hours ahead of schedule, with casualties that amounted to less than 5% of projections. Major Hartley radioed brigade headquarters with a situation report that bordered on the surreal. Objective reached with minimal casualties. Enemy observation superiority neutralized through counter-observation techniques. Estimate German defensive effectiveness reduced by approximately 70%. Brigade's response came directly from Brigadier Thompson himself. "Hartley, what the bloody hell did you do?" "Sir, with respect, I suggest you send an intelligence officer to debrief my lead sniper. We've discovered something rather important about how the Germans have been killing us." By 1400 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Ashford from Brigade Intelligence was crouched in a muddy hedgerow, whilst Lance Corporal Thomas Brennan, Manchester toolmaker's son, explained basic reflection geometry and its application to military observation. Ashford listened with increasing fascination, occasionally testing the mirror technique himself. Lance Corporal, this is extraordinary. You've identified a systematic technique that explains German defensive effectiveness across the entire Normandy sector. Every unit that's been fighting in the Bocage has encountered this. We just didn't understand what we were facing. Brennan felt uncomfortable with the praise. He'd simply solved a problem the way his father had taught him, by observing what was happening and working backward to understand why. "Sir, it's not magic. It's just Germans being clever with simple tools. The important thing is that we can counter it now that we understand it." "Counter it, hell. We can adopt it ourselves. Lance Corporal, how quickly can you train others in this technique?" By 1700 hours, Brennan was conducting his fourth training session of the day, this time for an audience that included 2 majors, 4 captains, and representatives from 3 different battalions. The Somerset Light Infantry's unexpected success had attracted attention up the chain of command, and officers were scrambling to understand how a technique of such apparent simplicity had evaded tactical doctrine entirely. The answer, Brennan explained patiently, was that military doctrine focused on what soldiers should look at: the enemy's positions, the ground ahead, the objective. It neglected to consider that soldiers could look at reflections of those things, that indirect observation could provide information that direct observation couldn't. The Germans had learned this somewhere, likely on the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces had employed similar techniques, and had applied it systematically to Normandy's Bocage terrain. "But now they know we've caught on," Captain Morrison pointed out. "Won't they adapt?" "They'll try, sir. But the fundamental advantage of mirror observation remains. It provides information without exposure. Even if both sides are employing it, the mathematics favor the defender slightly less than they did. We've turned their 70% advantage into something closer to 50-50 odds. That's the difference between unsustainable casualties and operations we can actually win." That evening, as British forces consolidated positions in Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, Brennan sat against a stone wall eating tinned beef that tasted of preservation chemicals and exhaustion. Jenkins approached with a tin mug of tea, proper British tea, strong enough to stand a spoon in. "Tommy, the lads are saying you saved the battalion, saying you're a genius." Brennan snorted, nearly choking on grim beef. "I'm not a genius, lad. I just remembered that my father always said the best tools are the ones your enemy doesn't know you have. The Germans thought their mirror observation was secret. The moment we understood it, it stopped being an advantage and started being a vulnerability." Davies joined them, lowering himself to the ground with the careful movements of a man whose body had endured 4 years of war. "The Major's putting you in for a military medal, Tommy. Conspicuous gallantry in the face of the enemy and all that. I'd rather he'd put me in for a hot bath and 3 days' sleep, Sarge. Wouldn't we all, lad? Wouldn't we all?" Davies lit a cigarette, player's navy cut, somehow acquired despite supply shortages, and exhaled smoke toward the Norman sky. "But you did something important today. You looked at a problem that was killing British soldiers and you solved it. Not with more firepower, not with more resources, with thinking. That's worth recognition." 22 German Panzer Grenadiers had fallen to the new technique during the day's fighting. Not all to Brennan's rifle, but all to the observation methodology he'd pioneered. 22 of Hitler's elite infantry, eliminated because one British lance corporal remembered that mirrors could show what eyes couldn't see. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, German commanders were urgently updating their defensive doctrine, trying to understand how British forces had suddenly gained observation capabilities that penetrated German concealment. In Wehrmacht headquarters, intelligence officers were analyzing the day's combat reports, searching for the secret weapon that had transformed British tactical effectiveness. They were looking for technology, for new equipment, for some innovative British development that had changed the battlefield calculus. They'd never understand that the secret weapon was a Manchester toolmaker's son who'd paid attention during grammar school physics and remembered that angle of incidence equals angle of reflection. Sometimes the most devastating weapons weren't secret at all. They were just principles so simple that everyone had forgotten they existed. The liberation of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer became a footnote in broader histories of the Normandy campaign, barely mentioned in divisional records beyond a single line. Objectives secured, with unusually light casualties through employment of innovative reconnaissance techniques. But within British military circles, the transformation that began on 16th of June 1944 rippled outward with mathematical precision, changing how Commonwealth forces fought in the Bocage and ultimately influencing infantry doctrine for decades afterward. By 20th of June, Brigade had disseminated mirror observation techniques for close country operations to all units fighting in the Bocage sector. By 25th of June, it had reached division. By early July, staff officers were incorporating mirror reconnaissance into formal tactical training. What Lance Corporal Brennan had discovered through necessity and physics had become established procedure, taught to every infantryman entering the Norman battleground. The statistical impact was remarkable. British casualties in Bocage operations declined by 43% between mid-June and the breakout in late July. German after-action reports from the period reflected confusion and frustration. Enemy infantry demonstrates observation capabilities inconsistent with terrain limitations. Previous defensive advantages negated by unknown British technique. Unknown to the Germans because it was conceptually invisible. How do you defend against an enemy using the same physical principles you'd exploited, simply applied more systematically? The Wehrmacht had discovered mirror observation through battlefield innovation. The British had turned it into doctrinal science, complete with training protocols, standardized equipment, and tactical integration. Thomas Brennan himself received the military medal in a brief ceremony conducted in a muddy field on 3rd of July 1944, with Major Hartley reading the citation over the sound of distant artillery. The medal recognized exceptional initiative and tactical innovation that directly contributed to operational success and preservation of British lives. Brennan accepted it with the same quiet competence he'd shown throughout, immediately requesting to return to his section. Medals were fine, but there were still Germans to fight. The Somerset Light Infantry continued operations throughout the Normandy campaign, eventually pushing deep into France as part of the Allied advance. The battalion's casualty rate remained consistently lower than comparable units, a statistical anomaly that intelligence analysts attributed to superior employment of terrain observation techniques. In practical terms, it meant British soldiers were seeing Germans before Germans saw them, and first observation in infantry combat translates directly to survival rates. Jenkins, Brennan's spotter, survived the war and returned to Liverpool, where he worked the docks for 37 years. He kept a mirror fragment in his toolbox until his death in 1983, occasionally showing it to curious grandchildren with the explanation that it had saved his life in Normandy. He never fully explained how. Some experiences don't translate to civilian life, but he'd polish that mirror fragment regularly, maintaining it with the care soldiers reserve for equipment that's kept them alive. Sergeant Davies was commissioned in the field in August 1944, a rare recognition of enlisted leadership. Lieutenant Davies led his platoon through France, Belgium, and into Germany itself, employing mirror reconnaissance as standard procedure. He survived the war, returned to Wales, and eventually became a schoolteacher, where he taught physics with a practical bent that emphasized real-world applications. His students occasionally noticed that he kept a small mirror on his desk, a teaching tool, he explained, for demonstrating reflection principles. Major Hartley, promoted to lieutenant colonel, commanded the Somerset Light Infantry through the final campaigns. Post-war, he wrote the battalion's official history, devoting an entire chapter to the mirror technique and Bocage warfare. The chapter concluded with characteristic British understatement. It is noteworthy that military innovation need not always require technological advancement. Occasionally, the application of fundamental principles to practical circumstances proves sufficient to achieve tactical advantage. But the technique's influence extended beyond personal stories. In 1948, the British Army's infantry training manual incorporated mirror reconnaissance, a standard procedure for operations in close country. The technique was taught at Sandhurst, demonstrated at infantry training depots, and included in tactical exercises. Soldiers who'd never heard of Thomas Brennan learned to use mirror fragments for indirect observation, unaware they were employing a methodology pioneered by a Manchester toolmaker's son in Norman hedgerows. The mirror observation technique influenced post-war doctrine development in unexpected ways. Military theorists recognized that Brennan's innovation represented a category of tactical thinking that formal training often neglected, the application of civilian knowledge and non-military principles to combat problems. This recognition contributed to broader reforms in military education, emphasizing problem-solving over rote doctrine and encouraging soldiers to bring their civilian expertise to military challenges. In 1987, when German military archives were opened for historical research, British historians discovered Wehrmacht intelligence reports from June-July 1944 detailing frustrated attempts to understand British observation capabilities. One report, dated 27th June 1944, noted, "British infantry demonstrates consistent ability to identify and neutralize observation posts through methodology that defeats conventional concealment. Recommend urgent investigation of potential British technological advantage in optical equipment." The Germans had assumed technology. They'd never considered that their own technique had simply been understood and countered. Thomas Brennan himself returned to Manchester after demobilization in 1946, resuming work in his father's machine shop. He rarely discussed the war, maintaining the characteristic reticence of his generation. The military medal went in a drawer, occasionally shown to visiting children who asked if Grandad had been in the war. He'd acknowledge that he had, redirect conversation to more pleasant topics, and return to whatever mechanical problem currently occupied his attention. In 1974, a military historian researching Bocage tactics tracked Brennan down, requesting an interview. Over tea in a Manchester sitting room, the historian asked how Brennan had developed the mirror technique. Brennan's answer was characteristically practical. "My father taught me that there's always another way to look at a problem, literally in this case. The Germans were looking at the ground. I looked at the light. That's all it was." But the impact was extraordinary, the historian pressed. "You changed tactical doctrine." "I kept my mates alive," Brennan corrected. "That's what mattered. The doctrine and the history and all that, that's for you academics to worry about. I was just trying to make sure Jenkins and the other lads could go home to their families." That interview, published in a 1976 military journal, represents one of the few times Brennan discussed his wartime service in detail. The article concluded with the observation that military innovation often emerges from junior ranks, precisely because those soldiers face the immediate tactical problems without the bureaucratic constraints that limit senior officers. Brennan had seen a problem, developed a solution, and implemented it, not because doctrine permitted it, but because dying mates demanded it. Thomas Brennan died in 1989, aged 69, of complications from lung disease, a condition not uncommon in machinists of his generation who'd worked with cutting oils and metal dust. His obituary in the Manchester Evening News mentioned his wartime service in a single line. Thomas served with distinction in the Somerset Light Infantry during the Second World War, receiving the Military Medal for gallantry. The mirror technique that had saved countless lives went unmentioned, a tactical innovation known to military historians but invisible to civilian readers. But within British military circles, Brennan's legacy endured. The Royal Military Academy Sandhurst added his case study to curriculum on tactical innovation, using it to illustrate how unconventional thinking can overcome systematic disadvantages. Infantry training emphasized the principle he demonstrated, that observation is warfare's foundation, and whoever controls observation typically controls outcomes. Mirror reconnaissance became one tool among many in the British Army's tactical repertoire, employed in subsequent conflicts wherever terrain limited conventional observation methods. The 22 German Panzer Grenadiers, who fell to mirror-guided operations on 16 June 1944, represented far more than tactical victories. They demonstrated the moment when British infantry adapted to Bocage warfare, when innovation countered fieldcraft, when physics became weaponry. The Germans had expected months of attritional fighting in the hedgerows. Instead, they faced British forces who'd learned to see through mirrors and shoot through hedgerows, transforming defensive advantages into vulnerabilities within days. The broader strategic impact is impossible to quantify precisely, but military analysts generally agree that improved British performance in Bocage fighting between mid-June and late July 1944 contributed materially to the timeline of Allied breakout operations. Faster clearance of the Bocage sector enabled earlier commitment of armoured forces to exploitation operations, which accelerated the collapse of German defensive positions. In the strategic calculus of the Normandy campaign, days mattered enormously, and the days saved through reduced casualties and faster advances created operational opportunities that might otherwise not have existed. In the end, Thomas Brennan's legacy resides not in monuments or public recognition, but in the quiet accumulation of lives saved and battles won through the simple act of looking at problems differently. He demonstrated that warfare's fundamental challenge, seeing the enemy before the enemy sees you, could be addressed through applied physics rather than superior technology. He'd proven that innovation doesn't require laboratories or research budgets, merely the willingness to remember that scientific principles exist, whether you're in a machine shop or a hedgerow. The mirror fragments salvaged from Norman farmhouses in June 1944 are long since discarded, replaced by more sophisticated optical equipment. But the principle Brennan pioneered, that indirect observation can provide advantages impossible through direct line of sight, remains embedded in military doctrine worldwide. Modern soldiers using periscopes, drones, remote sensors, and networked observation systems are, in essence, applying Thomas Brennan's innovation with technological enhancement, seeing what enemies hide by looking where they don't expect observation. And somewhere in the vast archives of the Imperial War Museum, filed among thousands of similar documents, rests Major Hartley's final report on the Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer operation. The report's conclusion captures the essence of what occurred in those Norman hedgerows. Operations demonstrated that tactical superiority derives not exclusively from material advantage, but equally from intellectual adaptation. One soldier's application of fundamental principles achieved what increased firepower and reinforcements could not. Recommend this case be studied as exemplar of how warfare rewards innovation at every rank. Thomas Brennan, Manchester toolmaker's son, never sought to be a military theorist or tactical innovator. He'd simply looked at a problem that was killing his mates, remembered principles his father had taught him, and applied them with the same precision he'd learned at the lathe. In doing so, he changed how armies think about observation, demonstrated that simple solutions can solve complex problems, and saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to German marksmanship in Norman hedgerows. That's the legacy worth remembering. Not the medals or citations, but the fundamental truth that warfare is ultimately a human endeavor, and human ingenuity, applied with courage, persistence, and clear thinking, remains the most decisive weapon any army possesses. 22 German Panzer Grenadiers vanished not because of superior British technology, but because one British soldier looked at light instead of ground, thought about angles instead of cover, and remembered that sometimes the best weapon is knowledge that's been there all along, waiting for someone clever enough to recognize its value. If you found Thomas Brennan's story compelling, if you're fascinated by how British ingenuity and resilience turned the tide in Normandy's deadliest terrain, then you'll want to join our community of history enthusiasts. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the Second World War, where ordinary British servicemen and women achieved extraordinary things through determination, innovation, and that indomitable spirit that's defined this nation through its darkest hours. Drop a comment below. What lesser-known British innovations from the war fascinate you most? What stories of wartime ingenuity would you like us to explore next? Your suggestions help shape our content, and your engagement keeps these crucial histories alive for future generations. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our weekly deep dives into the hidden histories of Britain at war. The stories that didn't make the headlines but changed the course of history nonetheless. Because understanding how we prevailed in our finest hour requires remembering not just the famous battles, but the clever solutions, the quiet heroes, and the moments when British resourcefulness transformed impossible situations into achievable victories. Thank you for watching, and remember, history's greatest lessons often come from its least famous teachers. Thomas Brennan never sought glory. He just solved a problem that was killing his mates. In doing so, he taught us that innovation doesn't require genius, merely the courage to look at old problems in new ways.